So we've all been watching the news out of the United Kingdom this past week, I'm sure. We Americans do have a bit of a fascination with all things British royalty. And to be fair, Queen Elizabeth's death is certainly a really significant event in the lives of the people of Britain and on the global stage. So I've appreciated the news coverage and reflections that have been coming out, just reflecting, thinking through her life and her legacy. But it's possible that because of that really big news coming out of the UK, you may have missed the other news out of Great Britain this week, which is the release of a new season of the Great British Baking Show. In the US, it drops on Netflix this Friday. I adore that show. I am not ashamed to admit it. It's just delightful. I lived in London for a time in my early 20s, so it brings back good memories just to hear the accent. But also, the things that these amateur bakers create, especially under a tight time restriction, they're incredible. The cakes, the breads, the biscuits, they're amazing. And there's also the drama of it, right? Because inevitably, at least a few times each season, there will be someone who makes something and it doesn't turn out the way they expected. Maybe the bread doesn't rise, or the cake is burned, or whatever. And they know they can't serve that to the judges, and so they take it and they toss it in the bin, the garbage can. It's the most painful moment to watch, knowing that something that they painstakingly created has to be discarded, tossed in the bin. But we've all been there, right? How many of us have had to throw away a dish that we've made because it's really not edible? Yeah, I've got a few willing to admit it. And what about other creative endeavors? What do you do when something you're creating doesn't turn out the way you thought it would? You're in the wood shop and something you're working on cracks. You're drawing a picture and something gets spilled on it. You're writing a sermon and you realize, I cannot preach that. How does that feel? It feels terrible. But you know that you're just going to have to start over. Today, we heard a story of God who realizes that his creation is not turning out the way God thought it would. The world has betrayed God's intent. It's refusing to truly be God's creation, refusing to honor God as God. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. This morning, we come face to face with a God who takes seriously God's purposes for creation, who becomes frustrated when those purposes are resisted. But even more than that, face to face, this passage boldly takes us into the heart of God. We heard the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. This is not an angry God, as we sometimes imagine, but a grieving parent who's devastated that there's something deeply wrong with the world he loves. The evil heart of humankind troubles the heart of God. This is a heart-to-heart between God and God's people. God is impacted by the pain and the violence and the evil that we experience and perpetuate. What we do affects the heart of God. This is not a God who stands remote, far away, watching what's going on in a disinterested way. This is a God who's willing to enter into the pain and the suffering of the world, a God who's willing to endure hurt because of and for the sake of his creation. God is brokenhearted. And what becomes of the brokenhearted who had love that's now departed? I know God's got to find some kind of peace of mind, maybe. And so our brokenhearted God considers what to do. And God thinks, maybe it's just got to be thrown away, tossed in the bin, start over from scratch. That's the part of the story that's really terrible, right? This is the part that makes us think, why in the world do we use Noah's Ark as a theme for babies' nurseries, right? I mean, I get it, the animals are cute. Noah's typically depicted as, a jolly old man. We get the rainbow. But there's something about wallpapering my baby's room with these signs of death and destruction of the whole world that doesn't quite fit. It's an awful story, this flood. So what do we do with it? Well, some scholars have pointed out that the word that's used to describe the corruption that human beings bring on the earth before the flood, and the word that's used for the destruction that the flood itself brings, is from the same root word. There's this connection between what the humans are doing and what happens as a result of it. It sort of implies that the destruction of the earth is the result of the violence and the corruption of human beings, the violence and corruption that fill the earth long before the floodwaters cover it. And this use of the same word to describe both the sin and the punishment or the consequence for sin is really not uncommon in the Hebrew Bible at all. Human evil, ra'ah, results in punishment or consequences, also the word ra'ah, for that evil. It's the same word. In other words, we're punished not so much for our sins as we are punished by our sins. In the flood, human corruption leads to the corruption of the earth itself. We bring this on ourselves. But at the end of the day, this isn't really a story about us. We see this after the flood, when the Lord receives Noah's offering. God says, and again it says, God says in his heart, God says, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. People haven't changed. It's as though God is saying, I know that humanity is going to disappoint me, is going to turn away from me, but I choose to be God to this earth still. I choose to say, by virtue of the fact that I created you, you matter. And God says, I'm going to do something new here. People haven't changed, but God has. God has made the conscious decision to stay with and endure and sustain God's world, even with all of the heartache that we put God through. Now, God, of course, has always been committed to his creation. But here, with this covenant, we see a new deepened commitment on God's part. And we see how costly this commitment will be. Because it's not that God isn't going to take evil seriously from now on. Indeed, God's sense of justice and righteousness is just as strong as ever. But God will deal with human evil in other ways, which we'll see over the coming weeks. God will bless Abraham and Sarah and bless them to be a blessing. God will call the Israelites to be a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. God will call prophets to proclaim God's judgment and God's mercy, and to remind people of the covenant promises and call them into loyalty. God judges, but God also redeems over and over and over. And as Catherine Schiffendecker so beautifully writes, finally, when human sin and corruption have become so great that they threaten to overwhelm the world again, it is God himself who enters into the waters of a woman's womb, into the waters of the Jordan, to show once and for all that God is passionately committed to God's creation. And so out of heartbreak comes hope. And the really good news is that this hope is not in humanity. It's not in Noah being a righteous man. The hope is in what God is doing. I mean, Noah barely makes an appearance, really. In this story, Noah never even speaks. God is the one speaking and loving and hoping and changing, and in the end, promising. Our evil ways, our violence against each other and against the earth, our messed up projects that belong in the bin, none of these things have the final word. God establishes a covenant, an eternal promise. And God puts the rainbow in the sky not to remind us, but so that God might remember. And that remembering is over and over an act of gracious engagement with God's people. It is the remembering of God that gives hope and makes new life possible. As heartbreak can give way to hope in our lives, we can trust that we will not be forgotten. We will not be tossed aside. Instead, we too will be drawn into God's heart, a heart that breaks at our brokenness, even to death, and then raises us up again. A heart that surrounds us with so much love, that God gives us second chances, the opportunity to take our broken pieces and make something beautiful. God promises to wash us clean in the waters of baptism and nourish us at the table. We will not be forgotten. God remembers. God promises forever. Thanks be to God.